On the 22nd of June 1944, German Army Group Center held the Belarusian front with 118 tanks. That is the whole number, not 118 per army. 118 across an army group of 4 armies, holding a bulge that pushed nearly 400 miles east of Minsk and covered the shortest road to Warsaw and the shortest road to Berlin. There were also 377 assault guns, which put the army group's entire operational armored strength that morning at 495 vehicles. The Red Army opened against it with about 4,070 tanks and self-propelled guns in the assaulting formations alone. Across the operation, the Soviet High Command committed 5,818 armored vehicles, of which 3,841 were tanks. Behind those came 32,718 guns, rocket launchers and mortars, and 7,799 aircraft, against 920 German aircraft, of which 602 could fly. And the individual German machine was still the better machine. In the summer of 1944, a Panther could defeat the front plate of any Soviet medium tank in service at ranges where the Soviet gun could do nothing back. A Tiger was harder to deal with than anything the Red Army fielded outside of a heavy tank regiment. German crews were better trained, and German gunnery was better. German maintenance companies were the best in the war on any front. 12 days later, Army Group Center had lost 25 divisions and 300,000 men. By the middle of August, the total was closer to 400,000, and 28 divisions had been struck from the German order of battle. The better machine had almost nothing to do with it. This is what did. In June of 1944, the front had a shape, and the shape of it explains most of what follows. Army Group Center held what both sides called the Belarusian balcony. It was a bulge, and by that summer it was an anomaly. To the south, in Ukraine, the Germans had been driven back hundreds of miles across 1943 and the spring of 1944. To the north, Army Group North sat pinned against the Baltic. In the middle, Army Group Center still stood on Soviet ground east of Minsk, holding positions it had occupied long enough to dig properly. Multiple trench lines several miles deep, wired and mined belts, fixed artillery positions with registered fire. This was the most heavily fortified sector of the Eastern Front, and it was held by 4 armies. In the north, 3rd Panzer Army under Colonel General Georg Hans Reinhardt, holding a salient around the city of Vitebsk with the 6th, 9th and 53rd Corps. In the center, 4th Army under General Kurt von Tippelskirch, sitting on the tip of the balcony with the bulk of its strength in a shallow bridgehead east of the Dnieper. In the south, 9th Army under General Hans Jordan, holding the Bobruisk sector and the northern edge of the Pripyat marshes. 2nd Army covered the far southern flank and was barely touched. Facing them, 4 Soviet front. 1st Baltic Front under Army General Ivan Bagration in the north. 3rd Belarusian Front under Army General Ivan Chernyakhovsky. 2nd Belarusian Front under Colonel General Georgy Zakharov in the center. First Belarusian Front under Army General Konstantin Rokossovsky in the south. Two representatives of the Soviet High Command coordinated across them, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. The Soviet Planning Directive of the 31st of May is worth noting because it is unlike the Soviet directives of 1942. Immediate front assignments were limited to a depth of 30 to 40 miles. Wider objectives were capped at 100 miles. Nobody was told to reach the Vistula in a fortnight. The Red Army had learned to write orders it could actually execute, and then to write new ones when the first set worked. On the German side, the governing order came from Hitler personally. Certain towns were designated fortified places, to be held at all costs whatever happened around them. In Army Group Center's sector, these were Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Baranovichi, Minsk, Bobruisk, Slutsk and Vilnius. Every one of them was a road junction or a rail junction. General Jordan of 9th Army understood exactly what the order did to him and said so in writing. "If a Soviet offensive breaks out," he wrote, "the army will either have to go over to a mobile defense or see its front smashed." He was denied the mobile defense. Now the machines, honestly, because the spec sheet is real and it deserves the full accounting before it is set aside. Nothing about the German advantage in 1944 was marketing. The Panther's glacis plate was 3.15 inches of rolled steel laid back at 55 degrees. Which gave it an effective thickness against a flat trajectory shot of well over 5 inches. There was no Soviet medium tank gun in service that summer that could get through it from the front at any combat range. The Tiger's front hull was just under 4 inches, vertical, and its 88mm gun could defeat a T-34 at over a mile. The backbone of Army Group Center's armored strength was neither of those. Was the Stug 3, the assault gun built on a Panzer III chassis with a 75mm gun, 48 calibers long, behind a front plate of just over 3 inches. 377 of the Army Group's 495 running armored vehicles were assault guns of this general type. It was a genuinely dangerous vehicle. Its gun would defeat about 3.5 inches of sloped armor at 500 yards and about 3.25 inches at 1,000. It was cheap, it was low, it was hard to see, and it was the most produced German armored fighting vehicle of the war for good reason. Against it, the Red Army brought the T-34-85, which had entered production in the first months of that year and was rolling out at roughly 1,200 a month by the spring. Two changes mattered. The first was the 85mm gun, chosen for mass production in December of 1943. Less visible and more important was the second. The old T-34 had a two-man turret in which the commander also aimed and fired the gun, which meant that in a fight the commander stopped commanding. The 85 had a three-man turret. Commander, gunner, loader. The commander's job became looking out of the tank. Be clear about the limits. A T-34-85 still could not defeat a Panther's glacis from the front. It could now defeat a Tiger's front hull at close range, which the earlier model could not, and it could fight a Stug 3 on something like even terms, which the earlier model did at a real disadvantage. It was not a better tank than a Panther. It was a tank that no longer lost automatically. None of which would have mattered if the Panthers had been in Belorussia. They were not. Through the spring of 1944, the German High Command had convinced itself that the summer offensive was coming in the south, out of western Ukraine toward Poland. So the armor went south. The 56th Panzer Corps was transferred out of Belorussia to Army Group North Ukraine on the 20th of May. By one accounting published by the Warfare History Network, the transfer stripped Army Group Center of 15% of its divisions, 23% of its assault guns, half of its artillery, and 88% of its tank strength. That last figure should be treated as one estimate rather than a settled number. But the end state is not in dispute at all, because Karl-Heinz Frieser counted what was left and arrived at 118 tanks. The Army Group's only real mobile reserve was the 14th Infantry Division, which had been stripped of its motor transport. The 20th Panzer Division sat near Bobruisk with 56 tanks. Panzer Grenadier Division, Feldherrenhalle, was still being formed. German intelligence did not arrive at that judgment on its own. A deception put it there, and running that deception cost the Soviets real combat power. 4 Soviet tank armies were left standing in the Lvov area, and the Germans were allowed to see them. Reconnaissance aircraft were permitted through to photograph concentrations that were meant to be photographed. Radio silence was imposed where it counted. And then the Soviets did something a bluff does not normally require. They actually gave the southern operation the resources. 12 tank corps and 5 mechanized corps went to the Lvov operation. Bagration's Baltic and Belorussian fronts got 8 tank corps and 2 mechanized corps. 38 of the 54 anti-tank regiments allocated across all of those operations went to the 1st Ukrainian front in the south. 32 of 78 fighter and ground attack aviation divisions went south as well. It worked at the level where it mattered. On the 10th of June, the German Army High Command still recorded its judgment that an attack against Army Group Center would be a secondary operation. On the 14th, Army Group Center's Chief of Staff told the Chief of the Army General Staff that the Soviet concentration in front of 9th Army pointed at the wings of the Army Group. On the 19th, Army Group Center reported that 4,500 of 11,000 identified Soviet aircraft were now opposite it. The High Command saw no grounds for the concern. The Corps commanders could see the build-up. Nobody above them acted on it. The Soviet strategic reserves were never located at all. The 19th of June was also the night the railnet went down. Belarusian partisan formations had been told to resume attacks on railways and communications, and on the night of the 19th into the 20th, they detonated roughly 10,500 charges along the lines running from the Dnieper to Minsk. Some sources put the figure as high as 14,000. Bridges in the area went down. Telephone lines were cut in bulk. Many charges were found and cleared, and the effect was still that Army Group Center's communications were paralyzed through the first 48 hours of the offensive. An army group that has been ordered to hold fixed places now could not reliably talk to them. On the night of the 21st, Soviet units probed the German forward positions, and bombers went after the rear. On the morning of the 22nd, the artillery opened. In the north, 1st Baltic Front and 3rd Belarusian Front attacked above and below Vitebsk to cut off the salient. 1st Baltic pushed the German 9th Corps back over the Dvina, and by the 24th it had opened a gap 25 miles wide in the German line. The Soviet mobile forces went into it at once, and the 53rd Corps was encircled inside the city. General Friedrich Gollwitzer was given permission on the 24th to withdraw 3 of his divisions and leave 1 behind to hold the fortified place. By the time the order reached him, the city was already surrounded. He refused to leave a division to be lost on its own, and ordered the whole corps to break out together on the morning of the 26th. They abandoned their heavy equipment to move faster and ran into Soviet roadblocks a short distance outside the city. Vitebsk was taken by the 29th. The entire 53rd Corps, 28,000 men, was struck from the German order of battle. South of there, the Moscow to Minsk highway ran through Orsha, and Orsha was held by the 78th Assault Division, a formation deliberately reinforced with extra artillery and assault guns and commanded by an officer who was also the fortified place commandant. It was the strongest single defensive position on the Axis. The barrage of the 22nd flattened bunkers and detonated ammunition stores, and the 11th Guards Army, 5th Army and 31st Army broke through the 1st defensive belt the same day. The Germans committed their 1 available reserve division the next morning. The Soviets answered it with massed tank brigades and turned a tactical penetration into an operational breakthrough. By the 25th, the 6th Corps to the north had been shattered, and Soviet forces were moving into the German rear. Orsha was liberated on the evening of the 26th. 2nd Guards Tank Corps went up the highway toward Minsk at speed. Behind it, Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was fed through the gap, not to fight for the breakthrough, but to exploit it. 6th Corps disintegrated completely, and its commander, General Georg Pfeiffer, had lost contact with his own divisions, before he was lost himself to a Soviet air attack near Mogilev on the 28th of June. In the center, 2nd Belarusian Front's job was not to break through. It was to hold 4th Army in place while the 2 wings closed behind it. Tippelskirch understood what was happening and, on the 25th, authorized his units to fall back to the Dnieper. Field Marshal Ernst Busch countermanded him and ordered the units returned to their positions. That order could not be carried out because there was no longer a continuous front to return to. Busch went to Hitler on the 26th and came back with permission to withdraw to the Berezina, 60 miles west of Mogilev. On the 28th, Busch was relieved and replaced by Walter Model. The 49th Army forced the Dnieper crossings on the evening of the 27th and fought into Mogilev during the night. 4th Army began falling back toward the Berezina under continuous air attack. Movement by daylight was effectively impossible. The main body reached the crossings on the 30th of June and largely got across by the 2nd of July into a trap that had already been built. The southern shoulder is where the operation was won, and it was won by an argument Rokossovsky nearly lost. Stalin and the General Staff wanted one concentrated blow at Bobruisk. Rokossovsky insisted on two of equal weight, one from Rogachev in the north and one from Parichi in the south, and he staked his position on it. He got his way. Zhukov supervised the northern blow, the Third Army under Alexander Gorbatov. Rokossovsky ran the southern group himself. On the 24th, 7,000 guns, mortars and Katyusha launchers of 1st Belarusian Front opened on 9th Army. In the north, Gorbatov's assault ran into obstinate defense and took heavy casualties for very little ground. In the south, the line was thinly held because of what lay in front of it. Pavel Batov's 65th Army did not attack the German position at Parichi. It went around it through swampy ground the German command had assessed as impassable to a mechanized force. Soviet combat engineers laid corduroy log roads through the wetland, which is exactly what it sounds like, logs laid crosswise in the mud until a surface exists that will carry a tank. The Germans had the swamp under observation. They had no troops in it, because there was no reason to put troops in ground nothing could cross. Behind Batov went the cavalry mechanized group under Lieutenant General Isa Pliev, the 4th Guards Cavalry Corps and the 1st Mechanized Corps together. Moved along the edge of the Pripyat marshes, took the fortified place at Slutsk and swung north into 9th Army's rear, which closed the southern escape. The 20th Panzer Division, the Army Group's 1 Panzer Division in that sector, was committed north against Gorbatov's breakthrough, then ordered to turn around and go south against Batov. 56 tanks, split, moved twice, arriving late at both. By the 27th, the 35th Corps with 5 divisions was pinned against the Berezina, and the 41st Panzer Corps had been broken through, and both were encircled east of Bobruisk under continuous air attack. As many as 70,000 men were lost or taken prisoner there. The Bobruisk itself fell on the 29th. The German High Command finally accepted on the 26th of June that this was the main Soviet offensive and that Minsk was the objective. On the 26th, the 5th Panzer Division was ordered back from the Ukrainian sector and it reached Minsk on the 27th. 1 Panzer Division arriving into a collapse that was 5 days old. 2nd Guards Tank Corps broke into Minsk in the early hours of the 3rd of July. The city was cleared the following day. 5th Guards Tank Army and the 65th Army closed the ring to the west, and roughly 100,000 men of 4th Army and the remnants of 9th Army were inside it. Around 40,000 were lost, and most of the remainder were captured. A fraction got out. So take the deciders one at a time, because each one is measurable. The first is that the breakthroughs happened where the German armor was not, and that was arranged rather than lucky. Every panzer formation moved to Ukraine in May, and June was a formation that could not intervene in Belorussia in June. The 56th Panzer Corps left on the 20th of May. What Army Group Center had left on the 22nd of June was 1 Panzer Division of 56 tanks in the south, 1 demotorized infantry division as Army Group Reserve, and a Panzer Grenadier Division that had not finished forming. The second is artillery, and it is a question of density rather than of totals. Across the late war, the Red Army's practice on a breakthrough sector ran between 240 and 320 guns for every mile of attack frontage. Those tubes were not spread along the line. They were stacked on the few miles that were going to be attacked, and everywhere else was left thin on purpose. The 7,000 tubes that opened at Bobruisk on the 24th were firing into a fraction of 9th Army's frontage. The third is what the columns did when they met a strong point, which was to leave it alone. The fortified place order had turned Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, Slutsk and Minsk into garrisons that could not move. A garrison that cannot move cannot threaten a column that drives past it. So the Soviet mobile formations drove past. The strongpoints were reduced afterward, at leisure, by the follow-on rifle armies, and in several cases by partisan units. Every fortified place did to its own garrison exactly what General Jordan predicted in writing before the offensive began. The fourth is the echelon structure, and it is the least glamorous idea in the operation. The Soviet tank and mechanized corps were not used to break the front. Rifle armies with the artillery broke the front. The armor was held back and then pushed through the hole to run into the operational depth, which is why 5th Guards Tank Army does not appear in the Orsha fighting and does appear on the Berezina 3 days later. Armor used as a battering ram gets consumed against prepared defenses. Used instead as an exploitation echelon, it arrives in the enemy rear, with most of its vehicles still running. The fifth is the ground itself, and the corduroy roads at Perichi are the cleanest example in the whole operation of an engineer decision beating an armor decision. German planners assessed the marsh correctly by the standards of 1941. It was impassable to vehicles. It stopped being impassable when a Soviet engineer unit spent a night laying logs in it, and the assessment was never revised, because nobody revises an assessment about ground where nothing ever happened. The sixth is the one that finishes the argument, and it is about recovery. Here, the honest finding cuts against the expected one. German Tank Repair Organization was the better organization, and by a wide margin. Each panzer regiment carried its own maintenance company. German units performed about 95% of their armor repair work in frontline conditions and recovered up to 3/4 of vehicles damaged in combat or broken down, right through to late 1944. Soviet repair was slower and less organized. Rotmistrov himself complained that his army depots sat between 95 and 185 miles behind him, with no welding equipment forward and no specialist teams to strip a damaged hull. None of that mattered in Belorussia because a repair organization only works on ground you still hold. A damaged vehicle behind an advancing front is a job for a workshop. The same vehicle behind a retreating front is abandoned where it stops. Photographs taken on the roads around Bobruisk at the end of June show the result. German vehicles of 9th Army standing intact and empty by the roadside, not destroyed by gunfire but left because there was no longer anywhere to tow them to. Run the arithmetic against the Soviet side. The Red Army lost 2,957 tanks and self-propelled guns during Bagration, out of something under 6,000 committed. That is close to half the armored force, and the offensive did not slow down because the fronts were moving forward over their own casualties and their own wrecks the entire time. One number in the record does not survive contact with the arithmetic. Soviet wartime accounting claimed 57,152 German motor vehicles destroyed during the operation, and somewhere between 2,375 and 2,735 German armored vehicles, depending on which version of the bulletin you read. The motor vehicle figure is plausible. Nothing about the armored figure is, and the arithmetic that shows it is not difficult. Army Group Center began the operation with 495 running armored vehicles, tanks and assault guns together. Reinforcements over the following weeks amounted to a handful of divisions, not 5 times the starting strength. That is a claim, not a count, and it should be read as one. The real German loss totals are contested in a narrower band and worth stating as a range. Steven Zaloga puts total German casualties at 300,000 to 375,000. Karl-Heinz Friese's work for the German Military History Research Office puts it at 399,102. Of those, 26,397 were dead, and 262,929 were missing or captured. David Glantz and Jonathan House put it around 450,000. Soviet wartime figures say 539,000. Every serious estimate lands somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000. What those men and machines added up to is the last point, and it is a point about armor rather than about the war. By German accounting, 27 divisions of Army Group Center were mauled beyond use. 19 of them were disbanded outright. 7 more were amalgamated with each other, and what came out the other side of that amalgamation was 2 divisions. By the count the historian Wilmot published, 31 of the 47 divisional and corps commanders who started the operation were dead or prisoners, and 6 of them were corps commanders. On the 17th of July, 57,000 German prisoners taken from the pocket east of Minsk were marched through Moscow 20 abreast, and even at a quick pace they took an hour and a half to pass. Set that against the Soviet ledger. The Red Army took heavier losses in men than the Germans did across the same operation, 770,000 casualties of all kinds, and it lost roughly half of its committed armor. Those divisions were not disbanded. They were refilled and they were in the line again for the next operation. That is the whole arithmetic, and it is the thing the spec sheet cannot show you. A tank's value is not what it does in the engagement it wins. It is the number of times it can be put back into the line. The Panther was the better machine in 1944, and it stayed the better machine, and 118 tanks in the wrong province were still 118 tanks. Once they were lost, the formations that owned them could not be rebuilt. The formations that overran them could be rebuilt in weeks, on ground they now held, with the wrecks of both sides lying behind them where a recovery tractor could reach.